There we go. Make sure our waiting room is closed there. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I hope everyone's having a good day on our final retail roundtable of the year. And I think we saved the best one for last year. We've got a panel of Management One insiders, along with our partner, Matt Dimitrison from Telemus Capital. And we're going to be talking about two different things. Number one, it's been a roller coaster 18 months here after COVID, and we wanted to do a quick check-in at the end of the year just to see what the state of the indie retail economy is from an external point of view. And then we'll move more internally with Paul Erickson and Dane Cohen to talk about what are the 5 top things retailers really need to focus on to succeed in 2023. So before we get into the meat of the conversation here, I did want to share with folks that this is going to be an open conversation. So we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to submit questions that are relevant to your business. So right down there at the bottom of your Zoom panel, just hit the Q&A button at any point, and we are going to save time at the end for a little bit of Q&A, or you can use the chat function as well, completely up to you. Before we start, I did want to also introduce you to Management One. If you're not familiar with who we are, thank you for joining today. So our main purpose really is to provide financial security for our people, our clients, and our retail experts. And we do that with a specific focus on merchandise intelligence and education, like these sessions here, specifically for independent retailers. We operate with a core set of values, including a generous heart, courage, curiosity, adaptability, commitment, and collaboration, especially with outside partners like Telemus Capital. We try to stay in our own lane here at Management One with inventory and merchandise intelligence. So we really lean hard on our partners to give us the inside knowledge on a wide variety of things. So Matt was very kind to donate his time today and really dive into the external view of what's going on in the economy. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you and Michael Alec, president of M1.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Nico, and appreciate everybody joining in. I guess as we're kind of looking at the retail economy, I think the best way to really start is to kind of think about what shape the consumer is in. The consumer represents about 70% of the economy. So when we look at, and we'll talk in a second about, are we in a recession? What are the recession risks? But that really is going to be driven by the consumer, since the consumer represents such a big piece of the overall economy. So to kind of take a look at the state of the consumer, let's kind of first focus on kind of their income statement. And last week, they came out with the November unemployment data. In that data, they look at actually where wage levels are at. And the average hourly income for workers across the U.S. is up 5.1%. So, that typically is in the 2 to 3% range. And so because of this inflationary environment and because there's this strong demand for workers and not enough supply to satisfy that, you're seeing strong wage gains. And so with wages up 5.1%. The flip side to that, and something we're all acutely aware of and feeling in our pocketbooks, is the higher inflation. So over the last 12 months, the consumer price index, or the broad-based gauge of inflation, is up 7.7%. So the challenge with these numbers is they're all averages, and there's always the flaw of averages. And if we look at inflation basket, your inflation basket is going to be different than mine. If you own your house or you have a fixed rate mortgage, you're going to have a different impact of inflation than somebody that rents and is feeling the pain of 15% increase in rent rates if they're living in an apartment. Similar thing on food. Food at prices, as oddly as this is, food prices at home are up 12% over the past year if you're buying groceries. But if you're eating at a restaurant, those prices are up about 7%. So food away from home is actually less inflationary than food at home. So your basket of goods is going to drive kind of what that inflation feel is. But nevertheless, if we look at these averages, you're making 5.1% more in income, but spending 7.7% more just to battle the cost of inflation. Your net income, or what's in your pocketbook, you're kind of net 2.6% drag to your kind of net income, if you will. So how are consumers funding that? Well, they're kind of funding it through a range of things. The first, kind of on the asset side of their balance sheet, during the pandemic, consumers were able to save $2 trillion in excess of kind of what they had going into the pandemic. As this year's dragged on, that $2 trillion of excess savings has dwindled down to 1.5 trillion. That's still a lot of money. And when you kind of look at that, that's about 7.5% of the overall economy. That's still an excess savings. So even if we continue to face a lot of these pressures we've seen in 2022 and they persist into 2023, consumers have a long runway if they elect to continue to spend down that excess savings. The flip side is on kind of that personal savings rate. So that savings of how much am I saving of my income today? Well, if I have less net income because I have lower wage gains and I have more inflation, my savings rate is going to be much lower than what it typically is. And so again, we're looking at averages. So we have some people, particularly those that are on the lower end of the economic strata, that unfortunately gas and food prices are a greater share of their budget. They're probably dipping into that excess savings more so than maybe those that are more in the middle or higher income earners. And those are still continuing to save, but at a lower rate. So if you look at savings in aggregate, the personal savings rate is 2.4%. Kind of pre-pandemic at average, kind of 7 to 8%. And so it's much below that. In fact, the only other time we've seen the personal savings rate this low is in 2005, right before the housing bubble. Prior to that, we've never seen the personal savings rate this low. If you look back to the 70s and 80s, the savings rate was kind of in the 10 to 15% range. So it gives you kind of some context of where we're at. That's probably a headwind as we go forward, but you tend not to see a lot of movements in that. So it could be something that gradually moves higher. And in fact, it could be something that moves higher just because we may get inflation under control, and that net income that we're facing right now in the consumer's income state, hopefully that turns positive and some of that money goes into savings. It may not impact their consumption, but we'll kind of see. Time will tell. The other way consumers are really funding that negative net income, if you will, is through higher credit card debt. So credit card debt's up 17% over the last year. We're kind of at a 20-year high in terms of the amount of credit card debt that's being utilized at the moment. So a variety of different ways, depending on the consumer, their preferences, how much they saved during the pandemic. But that's what's kind of driving the state of the consumer at this point in time. So now let's look at kind of trends in consumer spending. And this is data that comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Of course, they're economists, so they're going to have to use some unclear and ambiguous words. So they look at things in durable goods and non-durable goods and services. And that's kind of how they break down consumer spending. Durable goods are truly physically durable goods, things like automobiles and sporting goods and appliances, things that truly are durable and will last. Non-durable goods are things that won't last. So that can be, food, personal care items, footwear, clothing, those type of items kind of fall into the non-durable goods. And then services is really a broad catch-all. It could be, banking and financial institutions. It could be your hairstylist. It could be your accountant. It could be healthcare costs. They also lump in utilities and housing in that. And so typically consumer spending, about 2/3 of that is services. The rest is goods. Goods are kind of durable and non-durable. What we saw in the pandemic, right? We all were stuck at home. We all stayed home there. So our use of services declined considerably. That's the blue line on this chart here. And if you kind of look and you see that vertical kind of gray shading, that's the pandemic, the recession we saw during the pandemic. So during that period, use of services fell off. In exchange, we were spending more of our money on non-durable goods. We were eating at home, so we weren't going to restaurants, which is a service. And then we also spent more on durable goods. We all know it was hard to get an appliance. People were buying bikes left and right. Things like that did really well. As we've kind of moved out of the pandemic and we're starting to get more and more back to kind of a normalized lifestyle, really in the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen an explosion in the use of services, which makes sense. Now people are, elective surgeries weren't happening. Now people are going back to the hospital and getting those things done. They're going out, and we know restaurant sales are up really strong. And in fact, if you kind of look at this blue line here and you kind of look at it from kind of a trend from where we were at pre-pandemic, we're kind of back in line with that trend. And so we're almost seeing the use of services come back. So if you actually go to the next slide, we kind of look at kind of these trends and break them down. So I kind of looked at durable goods, non-durable goods, and services and kind of said, what were those consumption trends growing at kind of pre-pandemic? From 2014 to 2019, durable goods were growing 6.5%. Over the last 4 quarters, they're only up 2.3%. Non-durable goods were growing about 2.7%. So kind of in line with the overall economy. over the last 4 quarters, they've actually declined 1.6%. And these numbers are what we call in the economic world, they call them real terms. So they are inflation adjusted. So this is even adjusting for inflation. Non-durable spending is down 1.6%. And then services, are kind of steady. They kind of grow at 2% a year. They've been growing at 3.2%. So the way I kind of look at this is we've had this the pendulum's really swung one way where services weren't being consumed during the pandemic and people were buying all these durable goods. And now it's swung the opposite way where what's really driving spending is services. I think we'll see the pendulum slowly over time come back to kind of that middle ground. But we are kind of seeing these big shifts in how the consumer is spending. So I think the question is, okay, as those shifts happen, what does that mean for the economy going forward? And are we at risk of a recession? And, if you look at some of the economic data, manufacturing activity is starting to soften, government budget spending is starting to soften from the level it was at during the pandemic, but still 70% of the economy goes through the consumer. And I think there is a higher probability of a recession, but I think it could be a very shallow and muted recession. I kind of remind people, if you go back to 2001, we hit a recession, but it was a very mild recession. It really only impacted the technology industry. The rest of the economy didn't really feel it. We unfortunately had the incident on 9/11 that kind of put us into a double dip recession. If that wouldn't have happened, we'd have come out of that without a whole lot of pain outside of what happened in the tech industry. We could be in a similar environment there. The consumer, as we talked about, they're in generally good shape. They've got some tailwinds, they've got some headwinds in terms of their financials. But when you look at it from an employment standpoint, which is really what drives their sentiment and willingness and conviction and spending, things are going pretty good. Wages remain elevated. This chart on the upper left is that kind of looking at the last 15 years of average hourly earnings, it tends to be about 2-ish to 3-ish% in terms of growth in average hourly earnings. We're at 5% growth in wages, and you guys probably have a better sense on the front lines than I do. But I think employees are still able to command pretty high rates and wages, and that's likely to continue to remain elevated for an extended period of time. On the bottom chart, we look at the ratio of unemployed to job openings. And so when you look at it, there's less than one job opening, or less than one unemployed person per job opening, or almost inverse 2 job openings for every unemployed person. At an all-time low. As you well know, it's really hard to find employees. So, as we're talking to companies and hearing from others inside the economy, people are going to be hesitant to cut jobs and lay people off. We're hearing snippets of that, and the latest was yesterday with Pepsi, but it's fairly small numbers. And I think companies may use this as a way to kind of get rid of maybe some of those C&D players on their team, but we're not likely to see broad-based layoffs because it is so hard to find labor. And the fact that wages are higher, that's going to lead to kind of some sentiment and confidence in continuing to spend. So that leads us to kind of think that ultimately we're going to have a fairly shallow recession. So I think to kind of summarize a lot of this, retail spending remains strong. I mean, it's defied a lot of expectations for the year, and it's in good shape. And that's because we have such strong excess savings and consumers are willing to spend. Where they spend that will shift in terms of kind of durable goods and non-durable goods and services, but that pendulum should kind of reset and get back to normal here in the near term. There is a higher probability of recession. We recognize that, but I think it'll be a little bit more shallow. It may not affect the consumer as much as it affects kind of more industrial and manufacturing activity. That below average savings rate will be a headwind over time, but think it'll be more of a moderate headwind that hopefully we'll work through, particularly if we can get inflation in check and consumers can kind of just elect to pocket more of their paycheck than they had, and hopefully it doesn't impact consumer spending. And then lastly, topic we haven't really talked about, but I think to think about it, as we've seen interest rates go higher, and they're likely to go a little bit more higher here over the next few months, that does kind of change the cost of capital equation for companies. And as we look across companies, one of the questions we're often asking companies is how are they thinking about their working capital management, not just on accounts receivable side. So the longer they can delay that out the quicker they can get those receivables in and the longer they can delay those payables, but also on the inventory management side. It's been kind of a unique environment where 2 years ago, you just did whatever you could to get your hands on some inventory. And today, with your cost of borrowing probably double what it was a year ago, making sure you have the right level of inventory and not have excess inventory is really important because your cost of capital is significantly greater. So that's kind of what we're looking at and seeing from an economic standpoint.
Cool. Hey, Matt, what is your sense, or what's Telemus's sense on where inflation might be going? It seems like maybe it's moderating. Is that your sense too, or what's your perspective?
It is. I think there's a lot of signs that it is starting to moderate, but it's not going to be a straight line. And so I would probably caution everybody, there will be some, I don't know when, and I don't know what will cause it, but probably in the next 3 or 4 months, there'll probably be 1 or 2 months where we see a little bit higher inflationary reading than people were expecting. There's just a lot of moving pieces. We've seen gas prices come down significantly. If those come back, that could be a short-term headwind. But I think a lot of the trends that we're seeing that we're driving higher inflation, whether that be lumber prices or car prices or even rents, all of those are starting to moderate, and are very positive indicators that over time we're going to kind of continue to see inflation continue to moderate.
Yeah. So I think that's I think good news for all of us. Although it's interesting because it is, part of inflation going up is wages going up, which as employers, of course, is painful. But the other side of that coin is that when employers are consumers, right? And when their wages are going up, that's actually positive for their spending power. So really is an interesting time that we're in. But one of the things that I really think about too is that these are all averages, and so there are different groups, right? Those higher income groups are much less susceptible to the effects of inflation on staples like groceries and gas, right? It's not a big deal for them. It's not a big part of their monthly budget. If you're in the higher income bracket. So, when you're thinking about your business, think about who your consumer is, right? And we've seen it in our data, right? That those higher end luxury goods retailers have held up better than the people serving more kind of blue collar customers. But overall, I have to say, I mean, you showed the sort of overall economy wide data. Our sort of smaller universe of management one independent retailers, we're still showing pretty decent year-over-year growth. The rate of year-over-year growth has moderated in sales for our customers. I'm kind of viewing it a little bit as a return to normal more than a kind of scary slowdown, I would call it, right? I mean, we had some really strong rebounds coming out of COVID that were driven by, the sort of benefit, the government, people being locked at home and unable to spend as much as they could, that were driven by the government stimulus to the economy. And that's kind of now slowing down. We're now, listen, retail is now getting back to be normal, and it's hard work, right? But I think we're in an interesting time. The other thing I always like to caution people about, economic data, besides the fact that they're averages, is that the media will tend to make them more scary than they are. Right, nobody drives like viewership of their website or their Instagram post or their Facebook post with people saying, yeah, things are basically okay, right? Like the sky is falling is a way better narrative. So I think just caution people about that. One of the other things that I think about is, a recession is an average, and in any recession, there are companies that grow. Right. And, there's a little company called Airbnb that I think everybody knows. And Airbnb was actually founded in 2008, right? Right as the worst financial crisis in most of our lifetimes was getting started. And it was a terrible time to be launching a company, but they had a creative idea. They had a unique focus on what they were offering people. And, in their latest quarter, they reported income, they reported $800 million in free cash flow. So, in hard times, good companies thrive with good ideas and a strong focus. And even great times, companies without focus can fail. So I think the real message here is look at your own data, right? Look at your own data. What is it telling you, right? And the clues that you can see in your own data will be things like, what's going on with traffic to my store? What's going on with my average order value, whether it's online or whether it's in person? What's going on with the number of items in a basket, right? How many items are people purchasing? Look at those for trends, right? Because that's probably more important. That is clearly the most important thing for you is what's going on with your own data, aggregate sales, but also some of these other indicators of demand. Also keep in mind, your market, especially if you're a locally rooted retailer, might be different than the national market, right? It goes to Matt's point that these are averages, right? And different regions have different dynamics. I know, for example, we serve some campus stores, right? The college market, and the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, their enrollment is declining, and the sort of regional economy is a little bit soft. On the other hand, Tennessee, University of Tennessee, Tennessee is in a booming region, and that college is growing, right? Enrollment is growing and investment is growing, and they're doing great. So local economies, pay attention to your local economy, pay attention to your own data. I think the other point I would make is, if you are worried, you should have a contingency plan, right? You want to think about, okay, what would I do if my sales started to get really soft, if I saw a decline? And we can help you with that, but contingency plans have to do with things like looking at, who are my best vendors, right? Do a vendor scorecard, right? We have a free vendor scorecard tool. Who are, where could I turn fixed costs into variable costs, right? If I had to, could I change salaries into commissions for my salespeople? What's the status of my lease, right? What can I do there? Do I have old inventory that is literally just sitting there gathering dust that I can turn into cash? Even if it's only 25 cents to the dollar, that's cash, and it's freeing up space and money. So you should have a contingency plan. You doesn't mean you need to pull those levers, but you probably want to, the time to get an umbrella is not when it's already pouring rain. It's when you maybe see some clouds, at least know where it is. And I would say also the thing we're going to see in 2023, my view is a lot of people are going to be scared of recession. And that's going to create opportunities for growth for people who focus on the right classes, who focus on those opportunities inside their businesses, on those categories where they can win and take market share. That's going to be very much class by class. So, I think that focus on where there are opportunities is going to be critical, because there will be opportunities. There are always opportunities, but particularly when some people are getting anxious and pulling back, you're going to have opportunities to take market share. And as always, focus on the things you can control. Don't focus on, the news headlines, and stay positive, right? A lot of this is about mindset. It's about looking for opportunities and moving forward. So really, I just want to say, Matt, do you have any final thoughts about the economy, where you think things are going? Do you have a crystal ball?
We don't have a crystal ball. If anything, the last few years has provided another dose of humility. And so I think to your kind of point, it's things can and will come out of left field on the economy. As we look at things right now, I think you need to be cautious, but I don't think you need to be overly concerned, because there still is a lot of really good things going on. And your point on the headlines, I think, is a great one. I think there is a lot of people that are dour, but they lose perspective of the big picture of what's going on here.
Yep. And as always, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Dane and Paul, because, there are a lot of things you can control, and there are a lot of opportunities. So I want to let them talk a little bit about things that are going to be particularly critical going into the first part of 2023 for managing inventory specifically, which, for everybody here on the call is your biggest single expense and your biggest single investment. And so Paul and Dane, why don't you share some insights with us?
Well, thanks, Mike. The first insight I have is a confession. This is going to come to a surprise to many people on the panel as well as the people in the audience, but I have been, for the last 15 years, an avid fan of the TV show Air Disasters. My wife always was shocked at that as much as I flew, because every hour, every week I watched the show, it would talk about a plane crash. And what was interesting, my uncle was actually a pilot for United Airlines, and he corroborated this. 90% of plane crashes are caused by pilot error. And that happens to be an accurate number. And I also feel that 90% of store closings are caused by owner error, whatever the economy is. And I think Mike and Matt were making comments to that. So we're coming to a new year. We all have our New Year's resolutions. I'm thinking about the book Ron Johnson came out with a few years ago, How Smart People Can Stop Doing Stupid Things. And so Dane and I have come up with 5 critical things to stop doing when managing your inventory in 2023. Start being more proactive and stop making these mistakes, because too many retailers that I know Dane and I talk to, we call sometimes paycheck to paycheck retailers. And what is a paycheck to paycheck retailer? I think Matt would tell us a paycheck to paycheck consumer is someone who just works every week and every 2 weeks and gets a paycheck and spends it all, and there's nothing left over. And unfortunately, there's too many independent retailers, whether the economy is good or bad, that are paycheck to paycheck retailers. They work the entire year just to get all their expenses paid and their inventory bills paid off. And so what Dane and I are going to talk about is stop doing that. And the first thing you see on your screen is stop front loading your merchandise, for goodness gracious sakes. Everything about retail is about new, getting new goods in on a regular basis, but knowing exactly how much to come in every month so that you can turn your inventory quickly. And I don't know how many times, Dane, I've walked into a store. I think you have a great story actually in New York, where you went into a store in September. You were telling me this the other day.
Well, yeah, Paul, and I called you because we talk about this all the time, and when it's sitting right there on a sales floor in front of you, it's really interesting to see. But I had to get my winter jacket for this season, and I walked into September to do some window shopping, to do some browsing, and I walked into a local store, and I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. I came back in November, and the same inventory, not one new style, was sitting on that floor. So what do you think I did as a consumer in November? Was I excited about any of those jackets that had been sitting around now for months by the time I had come back in? It's just not exciting. So I called you. I said, Paul, it's happening. How do I get in touch with this guy and tell him we need to flow new goods in?
I know. I mean, a retailer's ability to have new goods come in every week, let alone every month, but every single week, and not stop the flow as you get further into the season, like what you experienced with the store that you walked into. To understand that, and that really gets back to how you flow inventory with how fast you turn inventory, right, Dane? I mean, we often think, how am I going to increase sales in 2023? I'm having my sales are flat. What do I need to do? And we always focus on marketing, and we focus on social media and things like that. And those are all important things, but we never look at the mere fact that when people will come into your store more often if they see new things all the time. Customer visitation is directly impacted with how fast you turn your inventory. And if you're getting only 3 or 3.5 rotations of inventory a year, if you can go to 4, 4.5, we're talking about that alone can produce a 20% increase in profitable revenue. And retailers don't look at that as much as they should. And one other statistic too that I just want to share. And this is primarily in boutiques, but I think it's also true in many, many retailers that we serve across North America. We did a survey where 50% of the sales that you're generating every single month come from merchandise that arrives and is sold within the month. So today is December 5th, I think, right, Dane? Is today the 5th? I'm losing track.
Yeah, we're a little.
I'm getting older, so I'm starting to lose track of the days. Something that comes in today will generally be sold before the end of the month and never gets posted up into an EOM inventory. The power of new merchandise arriving on your floor is absolutely immense. And I don't think we can underestimate how important that is.
Well, and Paul, I have a great example of this, right? I mean, I know you know the answer, so we're going to pause for dramatic effect. But what is the most visited boutique in the entire world? It's Zara.
Zara, that's right.
It's Zara. And their visitation rate is 17 times a year by a customer. The average boutique averages about 2.3 visitations per year by their customer. And why is that? I would challenge anyone on this webinar, right, to think about when's the last time they saw a Zara commercial. It doesn't exist. Zara doesn't do marketing that way. Their visitation comes from 6 weeks, their merchandise is in and out. Either they sell out of it or they ship it out of their stores, and they don't recut merchandise. They have trained their customer to expect fresh goods and new merchandise every time they walk into that store.
Zara is the perfect example, Dane. And psychologists tell us why this is, by the way. Psychologists tell us that when we see something new, I mean, I always think about why people camp outside an Apple store before the new release of a new iPhone, when it's essentially the same iPhone they have, right? But they're out there in tents and they're waiting for the new, and everybody, yeah. So why do they do that? And we can learn that from human psychology, is that when we see something new, we see it and as the potential to reward us in some way. And actually, they've done studies on this. Just seeing something new in our lives releases dopamine in our brain, which is dopamine, I think, Dane, is the chemical about where, we get, when we have dessert or sex or, things like that, but it's actually the same thing. And I always you're using Zara as a great example. I like to use Costco, for example. I mean, Costco turns their inventory so fast that it's in and out before you even know it's there, and you wouldn't think they would because it's a warehouse. But when you go into a Costco, it's like a voyage of discovery. It's the selling floor is always showing something new. You go into Costco, you're going to go buy some ketchup. You walk out with a flat screen TV. Who knew, right? But you saw it, it was new, it was a great price. And plus, I think the other thing too, Dane, is salespeople.
Right. They don't want to sell merchandise that's stale, right? They're excited too. They're just as excited by new merchandise. And what do you think that they're going to show the customer first and get excited about and really push when people walk through that door?
If something's been in the store 6 weeks, it doesn't exist anymore for them. It's the stuff that just came in that they show and they try to sell. And so everything that we know about retail merchandising has to do with how you flow your inventory, and don't be that front-loading retailer that Dane was talking about. Don't bring it all in 2 months and then sell out of it the next 3 months. When the customer comes in 2 months later, it's the same merchandise, although now it's picked over, right?
Yeah.
Now it's hyper size.
I have one more little tip in this slide 1 before we move on. It's let your customers know where the new arrivals are. A simple sign, some signage, a table in the front, a rack in the front. Let your customers know where they can expect to find those new hot items and fresh goods that are coming in, especially, during peak season.
Here's a spoiler alert to everybody. If you tell your customers something, they tend to believe you. They really do. If you've got a hot item, if you've got a t-shirt that sells for $19 and you think that's a really good price, tell them that is our everyday low price, $19. They will believe. There actually was a study done where I think several years ago, it was quite a few years ago, they were selling rollerblades, and they were selling and they were advertising the same rollerblade with 2 different descriptions. One was low friction and the other one was high velocity, something like that. It was the same price. Where they advertised low friction as opposed to high velocity, that the sales in that website sold twice as much because they saw the word low. So it's, we buy things through our subconscious mind. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, I know, Dane, and talking about psychology. But, I think optimum turns goes hand in hand with your markdown policy. And I think that's something that we have to stop doing, which is stop valuing your margin over your cash flow. It is a fool's errand. And that is so, so important. For most retailers we work with, the shelf life of their merchandise is much shorter than they think. In a women's boutique or fashion store, 90% of the sales you get come from inventory less than 10 weeks old. You've got that inventory is a very short shelf life, and you've got to react if it's not going to sell very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think Mike was alluding to it earlier, where if you have dusty goods on your floor, that is just clogging up your cash flow. And you really have to start looking at your business in that way, that the goods on your floor are potential cash in your hand. And if they're not selling, at the store, right, that is just your cash sitting on hangers and sitting on racks. That's what it is.
That's in all merchandise ages. Isn't that right, Dane? Isn't everything aged to a certain extent?
I mean, maybe like a nice Cabernet you could keep on. That's going to age well, but everything else, you got some freshness factor there.
I mean, if you go to a Walgreens or a CVS and you watch someone at the magazine rack, and I've done this, by the way, and they pick out a magazine and they go, this is an interesting magazine. They flip through it And then what do? They want to buy, they take the magazine, they flip through and put it back in and take one in the back that hadn't been touched by human hands. That isn't, you see people do that all the time. So understanding that merchandise ages and the importance of reacting quickly to a mistake. Look, we all make mistakes. You know, I know when I told Dane this, you know, several years ago, Dane, you know, I made mistakes when I was a retailer. He goes, no, Paul, tell me it can't be so. It's impossible for me to think that I would make a mistake. But we do. And quite frankly, maybe we should make mistakes. We should push our customer a little bit to be a little bit more forward fashion if we're in that business. But how we handle those mistakes, I think, are really, really important.
Paul, I have a serious question though, because this is probably the question when I talk about markdowns with retailers. The number one question I get is, I see the value, but I don't want to be seen as a sales store. I don't want my customer to think of me as just a sales store. How do we combat that?
You know, that's interesting because those retailers who don't want to be known as a sales store or have a sale image, actually by what they're doing is creating a sale image. You know, so they're doing one of two things, right? They're never marking down at all during the season at all on anything. And they build up old inventory, which causes their months at the end of the season to start crashing sales wise. Then they have a gigantic sale at the end of the season, which teaches their customers to wait for the sale, or they wait and that they actually take markdowns in season, but because I call them timid markdowns, you know what I mean, Dane? I mean, those are markdowns. Those are, you know, like the dress was 120. I'm going to mark it down 99. Well, here's a newsflash. It didn't sell at 120. It's not going to sell at $99, right? You know, and so, but they're trying to preserve margin. They think, well, maybe I can still make money, you know, a little bit on it. And what they have to do is get that out of their mind. It's not about making money. It is selling it quickly at the highest price you can get that'll be gone in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. Get it off the floor as fast as you can. Most of your customers don't even know it was there. Get that off the floor.
I mean, probably one of the most famous sayings in retail is your first markdown is your cheapest. And I can't say this enough, and I talk to retailers all the time when we talk about that tepid markdowns, right? And they say, well, if something's not working, I'll mark it down 10 to 15%. 10 to 15% is not a markdown. That is a give me your email address bonus, right? That is what people now expect. That's not admitting a mistake, right? That is just letting it sit and linger. And then that markdown is going to go from 10% to 15% to 20% to 25%. And then you're going to wonder why your sales rack is building over the season because you're not letting that customer get that first hit at that cheapest markdown, which is the first. So, I mean, I would say, and Paul, correct me if you disagree, that 25% should be the starting point for markdowns. And that's even a little bit.
Well, there was actually a study done in December of 2019, pre-pandemic December, and they surveyed women throughout the United States in shopping centers during Christmas shopping, and they asked them what would the percentage off be that would influence you to walk into a store that you normally don't shop. And you know what it was? 40, 20, you're right, 15%, 20% off doesn't have any meaning whatsoever. In fact, we could have a whole discussion, Dane, for an hour, and the whole idea of why you shouldn't even be taking percentage markdowns to begin with, right? But at the same time, you know, we should be thinking about, by the way, how we take markdowns. First of all, it should be hard, fast, and get it out quickly. That's number one. But number two is, you know, percentage off, you're doing two things to a customer, I think. Number one is that you're causing them to make a mathematical calculation, you know, when we all stink at math to begin with. And number two is, like you were saying, 15% off is to get your email address. 25% off hardly works at all anymore. They expect at least 40% off. And that is an addiction, that the more and more in percentage off that you're offering, the more and more the customers are demanding. And so we should think about maybe doing different things on how we mark down. We should think about maybe talking about rather how much we're saving instead of how much we're marking down. Use a more positive thing. Save $50 to everything in this rack, save $50, things like that. Those are little tricks of the trade that we know that we have taught our clients over the years that really will help them move goods quickly and actually at a higher price.
Yeah, and I think a mentality shift here that's great is instead of thinking of it as what you're losing, in that margin, think about it in what you're gaining, right? You're now going to be able to take that money and reinvest it in better performing goods, because remember, we've learned from our mistakes. So you're going to be able to reinvest that money in better performing goods, which ultimately is going to end up being better for your bottom line. And I think that's a big mentality shift.
Look, Dane and I are not saying that markdowns are not an expense. Markdowns are a true expense. It's interesting, markdowns don't show up on your income statement. They just increase your cost of goods sold, but they're every real as an expense as your payroll or your rent. But we don't track them, or we don't write a checkout thing for them, right, Dane? For markdowns, but they're a real expense. And so, in an era now, as Matt was saying, that we still are, we're still dealing with rising inflation, and we still have this issue with markdowns in most of our client stores. How we pay for that is really how we price our goods. And so I think that's the third thing I think that Dana and I would like to talk about is, stop thinking you cannot get more initial markup on your merchandise. That pause was for you, Dave, to say something.
Oh, yes. Well, so let's talk about your markup, right? So this is so again, and I go back to conversations that we continuously have, right? And one of the things I always hear is, well, I just mark everything up 2 times, right? That's my markup. I'm just getting price in, and I'm doubling the price of cost, and I'm getting to my retail price. Or I try to be at a 2.2, or my vendor has already set the price so that there is nothing I can do, right? Well, there's 2 things here. One, there are a range of products that you can price to not attach back to the cost, but to attach back to the value that your customer perceives for this item. So here's a great holiday item, for instance, that you can price as well, right? A candle. If you get a great scented candle in from a vendor, okay, you're on fair, you're shopping around, you get in a candle, your customer is buying that because there is a value. They're buying a gift to it. So it is not so, they don't know if that price is supposed to be $24 or $34, right? You get to set the value to your customer. There is not a competitive edge that they're seeing in the landscape that they say all candles are this price, right? So you have the ability to price an item like a candle, an accessory, a gift. These are important places where you can start building margin and looking for price increases.
The customer doesn't know what you paid for those candles. They have absolutely no idea. In fact, in survey after survey, when you ask the consumer, when you walk into a retail store, what do you think the markup is for that retailer? And their typical answer is 75 or 80%. They think you're marking things up 3, 4, 5, 6 times, when the reality is, as we know, is barely 2.5. And so, my view is that every now and then we prove them right, and we do get markups of 4 or 5 times. Dan, you were alluding to something I think is really, really important. We price too many things where we can get more markup based on what the cost is. And we don't base it based on what we think we can sell it for. And what that is, I call that the gravity of cost. In other words, if you and I were at a trade show and we saw an item that we really liked and we thought, we never had it, it's a little tchotchke, it's an impulse item, we can put it by the register, blah, blah, blah. And I say, Dane, what can we sell it for? And we both agree we can sell it for $29. And so then we asked the salesman, how much was it? And the salesman tells us it was $6. Well, if we knew it was $6, we'd probably mark it 18 or 19, right? It kept us down in terms of our price, but yet we've already determined that we could probably sell it for $29. So don't use cost, that try to stay away from that cost gravitational pull as much as you can. And the idea that nothing can be marked up more, and the idea that we're going to mark up based on some sort of strategy of 2.2 or 2.3 or 2.5 ratios is completely ridiculous. One of the most important elements of psychological pricing is what's called charm pricing, which is everything ending in 9. I know it seems kind of crazy that the customer thinks $99 is not $100, but they don't. And you know how we know they don't? Because everybody does it. It's been proven for decades that they always round down. But here's an interesting too, Dane, that I was just reading recently that I found was super interesting about this whole idea of pricing things with a 9. They actually had a study where that Princess Indian Nine were so effective that they outsold the same item at a lower price but the exact same item. In other words, they had an item at the same item at $49 and $45. And guess what sold faster? 49.
The
The
not,
$49 had a better view in terms of a value than even 45.
it's
These
the
are
yeah.
little simple changes in how you can trick the consumer's mind in pricing. And I think it's really important that everybody that's on this presentation right now understand this, learn about psychological pricing, because it can really help you improve your markup. And sometimes I think little things can improve it, like cents. Like if it's $49, why don't put 50 cents on it?
The difference, that 50 cents, that goes right to your bottom line, that 50 cents.
Absolutely. Every additional markup that you can get by thinking differently, thinking outside the box, where you can get it. Yes, some areas of your store you cannot get more markup. Yes, you're going to be dictated by price transparency, how readily available they can look it up on the internet, or if your competitor carries that item. But that is not everything in your store. And where you can get more markup, you have an open playing field, in my opinion, to get it. And it can make a dramatic improvement in terms of your cash flow and your bottom line, and can help you deal with some of these rising costs that we're all dealing with.
And Paul, could I say something a little controversial?
Why not?
There's a little bit of laziness associated with this, and I am guilty of it. Because when I was a buyer, right, it was easy to go back to the well of the brands and the vendors that I worked with. It's a lot harder to have to go out and have a sense of discovery to find some margin building items, whether that be trade shows. And now you could do it at the comfort of your computer through online marketplaces. So I think that there is a sense of discovery that comes along with finding products that could be great additions to your assortment that you could squeak out some more margin on, that your customer will still be wowed by. And it does exist, but you may have to do a little more digging.
I could not agree more. I've told this story many, many times in my seminars around the United States, but it's an important story. I gave a presentation in Florida years ago on pricing psychology. And after the presentation, my sponsors took me for lunch. On the way back, we walked by a high-end men's store, and the owner of the store happened to be standing by the front door. He sees me, he comes running out. He is at my seminar, and he said, "Paul, I've already instituted your pricing philosophy." And I said, "Already?" In 45 minutes, that was quick. He said, "I get back to the store. I'm going to the back room in the receiving room, and my neckwear buyer, my tie buyer, is unpacking this line of, I think it was called Robert Talbot neckties, right? And he looked at the prices. Every price on the tie was $115. And so he asked his buyer, he goes, "Well, Bob," or whatever his name was, "how'd you come up with $115? And of course, Bob got really defensive. And he said, "Well, we always price it at $115. And he goes, "Well, wait a minute, let's think about this for a second. Our customer isn't even looking at the price of the tie most of the time, right? They're buying a tie with a $3,000 suit. And so why don't we price them $119? Why $115? It's a ridiculous price." And so he goes, "Okay." So they marked him $119.50, by the way. And he said, "You know how many Robert Talbot ties I sell a year? About 1,000. You just added $5,000 to my bottom line. Just one thing right there." Anyway, the addendum to that story is about 2 weeks later, he called my office and he said, "I got to tell you something. I went out to Nordstrom's, the only other store in my area that sells this at that line. They were marked $129. Now, how long has that been going on that he'd been giving up markup? How long had that been going on that he was sacrificing his margin by being, as you say, lazy, or just not thinking about it? I think is really the better way than saying lazy.
It's bottom line dollars. So speaking of discovery and trade shows, right? We're heading into 2023. There is a huge amount of trade shows and events, and we're so thrilled to be back in person. Although I think we're kind of over that hump, right? We're fully back, and so we're walking into trade shows. And again, something I hear all the time is I can't walk into an event anymore or a buying event and feel like I'm winging it anymore. So I think this brings us to our number 4. Stop winging it with your purchasing, right? I mean, Paul, you give a great story about going on vacation. Can you share that with everyone?
Well, going to a trade show and you have to remember that if you have, let's say you're a relatively small store where you're selling $500,000 a year in merchandise. Well, typically you're purchasing $250,000 in merchandise. if you want to have a 50% gross profit. So you're purchasing $250,000 and you don't have a finite budget of exactly how much you're going to be spending and going in. That's like, it's like going on vacation and not knowing what the hotel cost is going to be till you check out. And you go, wow, that was a lot more expensive than I thought it was going to be. One of the best New Year's resolutions is right now is to start going to markets prepared with a budget and a strategy of how you're going to spend that money based on what your financial goals are, based on how much merchandise you need to drive your business going forward. And that is, I think, maybe if we say anything in this hour, that may be the most important thing that we can talk about, I believe.
Yeah, and this brings it right back to what Matt was saying, right? Your investments right now, we have to be smart and strategic with our investments, right? So when we're walking into a trade show, it is designed to make you want to spend and spend a little bit blindly. So you have to go in there armed with a strategy and a plan and an understanding of, we kind of go back to that turnover. How are you going to flow in goods? What's the plan? Right? What categories are performing for you? What vendors are performing for you? These are all parts that are going to go into creating a budget that's going to work for you over the 2023 year.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing, guys. I do think that, the situation with the supply chain has gotten meaningfully better. So I think, during a good chunk of 2022, a lot of our customers had to front load goods because that's what the suppliers kind of dictating. Otherwise, you couldn't get it. That ability to sort of flow more evenly or to chase wasn't there. But as the supply chain has started to loosen up, I think that opportunity in 2023 to go back to focusing on getting the flow right and flowing goods in throughout the season is going to be more viable and probably is going to be a better approach for 2023.
Mike, that is such an incredible point. And I think this is, and if we have any wholesalers on, hi, but their job, a wholesaler's job, a brand's job is to sell you, right? And they're going to use different tactics to sell you. They're going to say, you need to place all your orders right now or else you're not going to get the goods. And maybe that was true, but the supply chain has eased up in a way that goods are flowing freer. And there will be more opportunity to chase goods in season. So, again, when you walk into a market, you need to be armed with decision-making ability that's going to be the best for your business and then hold true to that when you're in market.
I think we're talking about running your business like a business and knowing what to look at. Making decisions. I think retail is always going to be a percentage. It's going to be gut and instinct and that which is a part. But when gut and instinct are 90% of your decision-making process when it comes to inventory, you're probably going to be making mistakes. Data becomes really, really important. And one of the things that I think we would say is the fifth one, Dane, I would say is stop looking at the wrong metrics when you're looking at your data. And one of the best examples is something called cost of goods sold, which we talk about a lot at Management One because we're a firm believer in cash flow. And when I say that, if there's accountants in the audience, I'm getting ready, they're going to have some sort of poison dart. They're going to hit me in the neck as I'm saying this. What are you saying? Stop looking at cost of goods sold. It's the basis for profitability in a retail store. But the problem with cost of goods sold is what it says it is. It is the cost of the goods you sold, not the cost of the goods you purchased. And I think, Dane, we use kind of an extreme example of that. I've heard you use that too, to kind of better explain it.
Well, your widgets example.
The widgets. Yeah. So you go to a trade show, you buy 50 widgets. I have no idea what a widget is, but you buy 50 widgets and you get a really good markup on the widgets. It's 70% markup, right? So after 5 months of the 50 widgets, you sold 5. You sold them all at full price. So you have a cost of goods sold. If it's a 70% margin is 30%. That's a wonderfully low cost of goods sold at 30% of the 5 you sold, but you still have 45 there you haven't sold that you've had to pay for already. And that is an extreme example, but it is an example of what we're talking about. One of the most important metrics to look at in 2023, and I think Matt ended his presentation around this. how you use your capital. The most important metric you need to look at is not necessarily your profits, but your cash flow, how you're cash flowing, because profits in retail can be very, very, very misleading at the end of the year. You can, if you end your year with too much inventory that you haven't sold, guess what? You're going to be paying the tax on that inventory you haven't sold now, just the way it's calculated in GAAP accounting principles. So consequently, it's very important. And what we teach our clients is follow them. It's like All the President's Men, that movie, you know, where Deep Throat's down in the garage talking to Woodward and Bernstein, and he goes, follow the money. Well, it's follow the money more than anything in retail.
See, I
Well,
like
and I think the point is that, you know, it's beyond, you know, inventory costing you in taxes, it's costing you more interest now too, right? If you're using any mechanism at all to actually finance your business, those rates are going up. So the imperative to be efficient with capital, which means being efficient with inventory, right? And focusing on the cost of purchases and things like your stock to sales ratios is really much more, even more important than it's ever been, right? Because you just don't want to have excess money tied up in your inventory, especially if you've borrowed any of that money, because the cost of borrowing is going up.
That's a really good point, Mike. And you use something that's also very, very important, not to get too wonky, but stock to sales ratios. We talk about it all the time. Anybody who's have any problem sleeping at night, I have a whole tape that you could listen to as you go to bed talking about stock to sales ratios. It's important, but you'll be asleep in 5 minutes. But it is important because it's measuring the velocity of your inventory and how fast you're selling it. And that is everything in retail. And what's changed, I think, from the pandemic is that the metrics that a lot of retailers used pre-pandemic are different today. And everybody's understanding that cash flow, debt is bad. The stores who really struggled during the pandemic were the stores that had too much debt. And so how do you get out of debt? Through better cash flow. And consequently, the new metrics are very, very important. And this is what we teach going forward our clients in 2023.
Yeah, and before we get to the Q&A, you know, having the right metrics and sometimes even an outside perspective to really take a look at your business, right? We start to, as retailers, to tell ourselves stories. This is my best-selling brand. This is my best-selling category. What are you basing those off of? If you're just looking at sales as a metric of success, you're only looking at a tiny piece of the puzzle. So stock to sales ratio is a great example of that.
And Dan, you talk about last year's sales too, by the way, LY sales.
Oh, well, looking like at LY sales as your barometer for future planning, it is the tiny, it's just one tiny piece of the puzzle. And I can't tell you how many times I see retailers selling themselves short. There is so much business left on the table because we're only trying to comp LY. So, right. You know, that's always something that I try to preach. So you
never see potential. You never see potential with LY. And if last year was so great, you know, I get remarried to my ex-wife. So, you know, history I would use. With that note, I think Nico is going to interrupt us.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on there, Paul. Thank you. I did want to open it up to some Q&A when we do have some folks that had some questions here, time permitting. So the first one I actually wanted to throw to Matt. Mark was asking, when you showed the different graphs, we were looking at unemployment, we were seeing the inflation go up. Has there ever been a time where we experienced inflation like this with low unemployment? And what are the implications of that going into 2023?
Yeah, that was a really good question by Mark there. Really only once. That was kind of in the 1974-75 time period. We had inflation over 10% and unemployment kind of hit 9%. And so usually inflation leads unemployment. And this was the only instance where that didn't happen. And again, so one could sit there and say we've had really high inflation. Does that mean we have unemployment on the come? And you know, it could go higher, but just the fact that we have such a low labor force participation rate that stayed so sticky low, it seems unlikely we'll have, you know, significantly elevated inflation, call it 6, 7, 8%.
Excellent. Mike, you actually talked a little bit about this supply chain. So Carol was asking, and this is more specific to the college bookstores. Thank you for joining us, Carol. Because of supply chain issues, college stores were encouraged to front load so that they had goods. So now that those issues are starting to ease, what is your advice about how to get rid of that extra inventory? What are retailers supposed to do with all of this front loading that they did because of the supply chain issues, which were real?
Well, I mean, I think that's where the conversation about markdowns has to come in, right? That, that's the strategic use of markdowns, right? That, because you do need to flow in fresh goods, right? But you have those old goods sitting there. A lot of, we do have a lot of customers who had that problem, right? Where, it even happened this year, right? Where maybe they had goods that they ordered for spring of this year that came in late, and they came in almost at the same time as some of their more holiday focused goods. So they do have a little bit more inventory. So really, this is where strategic use of markdowns is important, right? And so you got to make them deep enough to move the merchandise. You want to be targeted about them too, right? Like, in your store, it's rarely a good idea to do, 40% off everything or 20% off everything. Find the stuff that's not moving, right? Because you don't, your money is tied up in that existing inventory. You're exactly right, Carol. And if you want to free that cash up and deploy it to something else, and you also want that space, right? That it's taken up. So I think this is the place where a good markdown kind of execution is going to be helpful.
Yeah, and just to jump in, I think this is where we also could get a little creative as retailers, right? So, I don't want to just put it in terms of it just has to be marked down, or, there's also promotions, right? There's interesting promotions. If you have a lot of a certain style hanging around that you had a front load, right? Maybe there's a free gift with purchase idea that you could come up with to stimulate, so it doesn't, just go straight to a markdown. So I think markdowns are the overall kind of overarching discussion here, but there's a lot of, interesting promotional and creative ways to stimulate buying there as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I'm using markdowns as a generic term for how do we create more value to the consumer so that our merchandise moves faster. Percent off is one tactic, but the idea of creating interesting bundles, right? Bundling something that's not moving as fast with something that is popular, sort of an add-on purchase, right? Like if you buy X dollars, you get, anything on this rack for only $5 more. I think there's lots of good tactics, and it is a good time to be creative, right? And, that's there's things you can tie into local charities, right? To sort of, you're running a sale for a good cause. That's particularly helpful if you have a really big overhang of inventory. You got a lot you want to clear out, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, creativity is key. It's not just about dollars off or percent off.
And that's a win-win too, because you're adding to your average order value at the same time as you're getting rid of those goods. So I have a specific question from Mark Dankler at NSRA. He was asking about vendor relationships. So when a vendor has a certain percent off, do you match it or would you let it go, especially if it's a really high percentage, like 40 to 50%? Do you take the sale or just let it go? He was looking if there was any standard there.
My standard on that, Mark, is that I err on selling it quickly and getting it in and out. Time is one of the most important elements of retail that a lot of retailers don't understand. The longer it sits there, the more of the operating costs that are absorbed into that item. And so if you can sell something in a month at 10, 20, 30% off, you'll make more money than it sits there for 9 months and you sell it at full price. And so I would err. Now, obviously, if you don't need to do it, it'll sell with the extra margin, of course. But I think as a standard rule, I will take the money and run more quickly.
Excellent. This last one here, because we are running short on time. And this one is for Matt. I think it's a good one to end on because it's about consumer psyche. So Dave is asking, how or is the volatile nature of the stock market influencing consumers' psyche to make purchases, especially consumers with high disposable income and stock investments that kind of ebb and flow, especially in recent weeks?
It's a good question, and gets to some of that psychology that Paul and Dane were kind of touching on. I think in this instance, I think a lot of investors in the stock market probably kind of felt like maybe the market was a little better than they thought the last couple of years, and you haven't seen it impact things right now. There is a loose correlation kind of between how the market does and kind of the spending among higher end consumers. I think what's in the back of my mind, probably the bigger impact could be more housing and home prices. So I think people they recognize markets can be volatile and stocks can go up and down. I think a lot of people tend to think the price of their home and their value of the home is more sticky, and it just tends to go up over time. And so if we see some depreciation in home prices, I would say that could be a factor it gets incorporated to high-end consumers and their psyche around their disposable income.
Excellent. Well, I definitely appreciate all of your insight on that one, Matt, and thank you to Paul and Dane. Just for the folks, if you were taking notes, I know Paul and Dane went through a lot of different points within the framework of 5 there. So I'm going to put this link into chat there. We actually took the liberty of creating a document that had some of those notes in there. So feel free and click that link. It's going to be included in our follow-up email as well as the recording of this video too. I think the takeaway that we have here really is just what Mike said earlier. You know, when you look at the headlines, it's very easy to get down on the state of the economy and how that affects your business. But if you really break it down into your own unique experience, your own local economy, and your own strategy for how you're going to interact with your own consumers, it really becomes more of a psychological strategy game for each retailer. And how is each retailer going to take some of these strategies today and put it towards success in 2023 to their business? I think for Management One clients, they have the liberty of falling to our retail experts for advice. And for those of you who are not clients of Management One, I would definitely encourage a phone call to Paul or Dane and just have a chat, a 30-minute conversation on what your goals are for 2023 and how you can use some of these strategies to really move your business forward in the next year or years to come. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is our final webinar for 2023. Feel free to also reach out to us and see if there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss in 2023. We are going to be continuing these sessions in the year to come, and we would love to hear your feedback on what you would like to hear us go over on our next sessions moving forward. So Mike and Matt, Dane, Paul, I definitely appreciate your time today, and thank you to everyone who joined.
And I just like to say one
Everybody.
thing. Nico.
Please.
The answer, Robert, is yes.
Yeah. One of our great retail expert, Robert, was asking for some individual fashion advice from Paul and I. So we'll do that offline, Robert.
All right. Thank you, everybody. For the holidays, and we will see you in 2023. And please do let us know what you'd like to learn about from us and some feedback. We appreciate it.